side.
Let me explain something to you. These people today don't know what a strike is.
Right.
When my men hit the streets, from Maine to Texas, every single port will lock down. You know what's gonna happen? I'll tell you. First week, be all over the news every night, boom, boom. Second week, guys who sell cars can't sell cars because the cars ain't coming in off the ships. They get laid off. Third week, malls start closing down. They can't get the goods from China. They can't sell clothes. They can't do this. Everything in the United States comes on a ship. They go out of business. Construction workers get laid off because the materials aren't coming in. The steel's not coming in. The lumber's not coming in. They lose their job. Everybody's hating the longshoremen now because now they realize how important our jobs are.
In our timeline, such a scenario was avoided within days. Negotiators returned to the table. Compromises were made that satisfied no one fully but calmed the system just enough to keep America's ports moving. But history often hinges on narrow margins. So today's question is simple and unsettling. What if the strikes never stopped? What if the longshoremen rejected every offer, refused arbitration, and demanded their original terms, nothing less than a 70% wage increase, no matter the cost? The first days would not feel apocalyptic. In fact, to most Americans, they would barely register. News networks would loop footage of idle cranes and empty docks, framing the story as a tense but familiar labor dispute. Ships would begin to idle offshore from Maine to Texas, burning fuel while insurers quietly reclassified U.S. ports as high-risk disruption zones. Retailers would reassure investors that inventories were healthy. Government officials would issue calm statements urging constructive dialogue. On the surface, the country would still appear to be functioning normally, and that illusion would be precisely what made what followed so devastating. By the end of the first week, the strike would dominate the news cycle, just as Daggett predicted. Every night, viewers would see the same images: container ships anchored motionless on the horizon, interviews with defiant longshoremen, and port authorities warning of economic consequences. Yet the damage would still feel abstract. The economy would not collapse in a week. It never does. Instead, stress would begin accumulating invisibly inside tightly wound systems designed for constant motion. Shipping schedules would snap. Supply chain managers would stop planning weeks ahead and start planning hours ahead. Financial analysts would begin using a phrase that always precedes trouble: if this continues. The second week is where theory collides with reality. Imported vehicles would simply stop arriving. Dealerships would discover that the lots they assumed were full enough were, in fact, balanced on a knife edge. Asian and European automakers would idle U.S. sales operations. Commission-based workers, salesmen, finance managers, transport drivers, would be furloughed almost overnight. Local news would pivot away from abstract port footage and toward interviews with workers asking why they were being laid off because of a strike hundreds of miles away. For the first time, the strike would stop being someone else's problem. By the third week, the consequences would spread laterally across the economy. Malls would begin closing sections or entire locations because imported goods were not arriving. Apparel shipments from China and Southeast Asia would miss delivery windows, turning seasonal inventory into dead weight. Construction projects would stall as steel components, copper wiring, and specialized fixtures failed to arrive. Union construction workers would be furloughed, creating an uncomfortable reality where organized labor found itself divided against itself. The narrative would shift sharply. The question on cable news would no longer be whether the longshoremen were essential. Everyone would already know they were. The question would be whether they were holding the country hostage. By the fourth week, public opinion would harden. Grocery prices would begin climbing, not due to panic buying, but because imports like coffee, seafood, fruit, and spices would be delayed or rerouted at extreme cost. Inflation numbers would tick upward for reasons no interest rate could fix. Social media, once sympathetic, would turn hostile. Longshoremen would be recast not as workers defending their livelihoods, but as a bottleneck choking millions of unrelated families. Politicians would feel the shift instantly. Polling would show support collapsing. What began as a labor dispute would now be treated as a national emergency in everything but name. As the second month began, the illusion that this could be allowed to continue indefinitely would vanish. GDP projections would be revised downward. Pension funds would wobble as markets reacted to sustained logistical paralysis. International shipping firms, burned once, would begin making permanent changes, expanding capacity in Canadian and Mexican ports, rewriting contracts that had taken decades to secure. This would be the most important damage of all, because it would not be reversible. Lost trust in logistics never comes back quickly, if it comes back at all. At this point, the federal government would face a decision it had tried desperately to avoid. Invoking emergency powers or forcing workers back would be politically radioactive, especially for leaders who relied on labor support. But doing nothing would mean owning a recession triggered not by war or disaster, but by paralysis. Eventually, injunctions would be issued, orders would be signed demanding ports reopen, and in this timeline, the union would refuse. What follows would not look like negotiation anymore. Federal marshals and National Guard units would be deployed to enforce court orders at selected ports. Some facilities would reopen under heavy security. Others would become flashpoints of arrests, confrontations, and accusations of sabotage. International media would begin referring to the United States as a logistics risk, a phrase once reserved for unstable economies. Behind the scenes, shipping conglomerates would quietly decide they would never allow themselves to be trapped this way again. Months into the standoff, the union's leverage would collapse. Strike funds would drain. Younger workers would face foreclosure. Older members would argue to hold the line, believing that surrender now would make the pain meaningless. Congress, reacting to economic pressure rather than moral arguments, would pass emergency port legislation imposing binding arbitration and wage caps far below the original demand. Automation clauses, once resisted, would be justified as national security measures. Thousands of longshoremen would find that the jobs they fought to protect no longer existed in the same form. A year later, the economy would stabilize, but it would not reset. Inflation would linger. Retail consolidation would accelerate. U.S. ports would handle less global traffic than they once did, not because demand vanished, but because trust did. And organized port labor would be weaker than before the strike began. Harold Daggett's warning would be remembered not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. He was right that the ports could cripple the country. He was right that everyone would eventually understand how essential those jobs were. What he underestimated was how systems of power respond when they feel truly threatened. The lesson absorbed by government and industry would not be respect. It would be control, and in that timeline, the strike would not end with victory or compromise, but with a permanent reshaping of American labor itself.